Imagine yourself as a journalist. You're giving the most at your job like you always did, keeping the population informed about the latest news. But in return, what you get is death threats and a life of constant attacks from criminal groups. Stay tuned because in this video, we'll uncover a situation like that. The time a Mexican cartel gave a news anchor a reality check. The Uresti case. To properly unveil our story, we first have to quickly go through the two protagonists of this shocking clash. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel and news anchor Azucena Uresti. As a well-known fact by now, Mexico is a country terrorized by cartel activity. Turf wars, rambles, drug trafficking, kidnappings, mass shootings, executions, the list goes on. Those are all just some of the activities the Mexican cartels are known for. But while each cartel is terrifying on its own, there is one that over the last few years has gained more and more power and notoriety, enough to challenge the sovereign Sinaloa cartel's supremacy. We are talking about, of course, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG. The CJNG was born from the disruption of the Milenio Cartel, which was founded in the 1970s by the Valencia crime family in Michoacan. The group, according to journalist Luis Chaparro, used to be one of the most financially powerful cartels in Mexico. In the early 2000s, they were major allies of the Sinaloa cartel, which only maximized their influence even further. However, things took a drastic turn in 2009, when the leader of the Milenio cartel was captured, and in 2010, when the Sinaloa cartel boss was killed by the Mexican Special Forces. As a result, the mighty Milenio cartel broke into smaller and rival factions. One of those was none other than the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. The cartel's economic power started with farming, focusing more specifically on avocados. In a short amount of time, however, they quickly entered the narco trade, substituting the harmless avocados for drugs like methamphetamine. The reason for such a drastic change can be explained by the cartel's kingpin, Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho. Working in the narco business since he was a teenager, El Mencho married into the Valencia family and created an alliance with it that would eventually grow to become the CJNG we've come to know today. To stand out from its rival groups, the CJNG has devoted itself to accomplishing one simple goal: to be the most brutal and violent cartel in all of Mexico. In order to achieve this much-desired title, the group is always showcasing its firepower. They dress in army-style uniforms and are not shy to show around their heavy and military-grade weaponry. Their arsenal is filled with weapons such as assault rifles with grenade launchers and heavy machine guns such as a powerful .50 caliber sniper rifle. With such power, it is safe to say that probably no one would like to become enemies or stand in the CJNG members' way, especially when we consider that, unlike other cartels who tend to solely bribe the authorities, the CJNG members prefer to intimidate and threaten their rivals with their massive paramilitary violence. Many of the methods used by the CJNG were taken from another hyper-violent cartel, Los Zetas. What really sets them apart from any other cartel isn't their extortion or brutal violence against civilians, but their willingness to directly confront and attack the Mexican military itself. That is their main target, as witnessed in May of 2015 when the gang members used RPGs to shoot down a military helicopter they thought to be tracking El Mencho. But the list of the CJNG's acts goes on. They are well known for various massacres and atrocities such as the Michoacan massacres from April 2012, the Veracruz massacre from September 2011, 2012's Nuevo Laredo massacres, and so on. It is safe to say that the Jalisco New Generation Cartel is now recognized as Mexico's most violent and dangerous drug empire. Dangerous enough to be considered by the U.S. national security as a terrorist organization. With such willpower, we now ask ourselves, who would be able to challenge and come out unscathed from a confrontation with this cartel group? Who would have the courage to challenge this brutal paramilitary organization? And the answer is Azucena Uresti. Uresti is an experienced news anchor and journalist who works for Milenio Television, Multimedios TV, and Radio Formula Networks. She is well known in Mexico and often regarded as one of the most prominent professionals in the country. As we've already uncovered in this video, Mexican journalists are already brave enough to put their life at risk by solely doing their jobs in such a hostile country. After a news report released on August 5, 2021 about the disputes in the Terra Caliente region of southern Mexico in the state of Michoacan between the CJNG and self-defense militia groups, the cartel members' ire with the journalist became public. In the report, titled in Uresti's YouTube channel, "The Self-Defense Groups in Michoacan Are the Only Things Stopping the CJNG," the news anchor presents the report saying that at various points in the state, so-called self-defenses formed by rival cartels are protecting the city from CJNG's attacks with roadblocks. She then claims to have spoken to one of those self-defense group members.
Esta tarde, en pleno enfrentamiento, platiqué con uno de los autodefensas, quien me dijo que los integrantes del Cartel Jalisco intentan ingresar a la cabecera municipal no solo por Cualcomán, sino también por Aguililla, Tepalcatepec y por el Aguaje, donde ellos intentan impedirles el paso. Dijo que de entrar, acabarían con el pueblo.
In the interview, the member of the group strongly criticizes the CJN cartel, stating that Michoacan is for the Michoacanos and that Nemesio Oseguera and his group are stupid, had nothing to do with it, and weren't welcomed there. To end the report, Azucena makes a somewhat appeal to the National Guard to help those self-defense groups in the battle against the Jalisco New Generation cartel.
Era plena balacera. La Guardia Nacional dice sí está, pero no son suficientes. No pueden contra el número y el armamento de los integrantes del Cártel Jalisco Nueva Generación, por lo que las autodefensas por diferentes puntos tienen que enfrentarlos con un saldo de heridos.
The cartel's response came in a video released on August 9, 2021. In the footage, a group of 6 masked and heavily armed men is surrounding an individual seated at a small desk. He reads a statement he attributes to El Mencho, the CJN's boss. Although it is unclear if the man reading the message is El Mencho himself, the pronouncement goes straight to the point. The speaker says, Azucena uresti, wherever you are, I'll get you, and I will make you eat your words, even if they accuse me of femicide because you do not know me. Ruben Oseguera Cervantes, I am not a debt collector or extortionist, nor am I a kidnapper. As a representative of the Jalisco Cartel New Generation, I address this message directly to Milenio. I am not against freedom of expression, but I am against whoever attacks me directly. Threatening the Milenio TV network, the statement criticized what was described as biased coverage of the conflict in the city and demanded a balanced media coverage instead. Their main complaint was that the cable news channel would be favoring so-called self-defense groups that would be fighting the CJN in the state of Michoacan. The man ends the statement also threatening other media outlets like El Universal and Televisa. They also mention Hipólito Mora, a man who organized a self-defense force in Michoacan years before. Plus, they accused rival cartel leaders and groups, such as Los Viagras, of disguising themselves as self-defense groups and giving money to the media. That is because, according to them, those rival cartels would be the only organizations that could afford the weaponry they had at their disposal during the confrontation. While neither the source of the video nor the fact that those are actually CJN men could be confirmed, experts claim that such a public threat should be taken seriously nonetheless. It seems that in a country like Mexico, all efforts don't seem to be enough to stay safe, especially if you are a journalist. As described by the investigators, such a threat could mean an escalation of violence and intimidation against journalists in the country, a prediction that has unfortunately been confirmed, as we'll see right now. Mexico, a dangerous land. To understand this video's episode in detail, we have to understand the fact that Mexico is more than just a harmful, dangerous, and toxic environment for journalism activity. It is indeed the most dangerous place for journalists in the world. But why is that? Attacks on journalists are part of Mexico's larger problem with narco-violence and the constant turf wars between rival cartels and corrupt political bosses. Mexican citizens and investigators claim that the situation is worsened by the fact that organized Mexican crime operates alongside the state, meaning that criminals and politicians can silence journalists with near total impunity. According to them, advocating for freedom of the press is the root of the problem. As defined by Leopoldo Maldonado, director of the human rights organization Article 19, to be a journalist in Mexico, you have to accept the fact that there's a political class that resists and doesn't accept public criticism.
También ser periodista en México es moverse en un campo minado, ¿no? Es que tú sepas en tu contexto con quiénes puedes hacer y qué preguntas y hasta dónde puedes llegar si quieres sobrevivir.
According to the Committee to Protect Journalists correspondent in Mexico, Jan Albert Hutson, Mexico is suffering a multifaceted crisis with regard to press freedom. The situation has been getting steadily worse over the past few years, culminating in the country's abysmal status as the world's deadliest for reporters in 2020. The crisis principally stems from impunity. Various news reports over the years, such as The Guardian, have stated that Mexico has been the most dangerous place in the world to be a journalist, outside of an active war zone. But nowadays, the problem is worse than it ever was. According to CPJ, which investigates attacks against the press globally, 13 reporters were killed in 2022, 10 of them with motives still not confirmed. That's the highest number registered by the organization, which began tracking its data in 1992. And if the data wasn't unsettling enough, overall, 90% of all the journalist murders remain unsolved. Press freedom campaigners hoped that the situation would improve with the election of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador way back in 2018. The reason for such was the then candidate's promise to tackle violence against journalists and end the impunity for its perpetrators once and for all. However, as we've already seen by the numbers and statistics, the attacks have not only continued, but are much worse. And surprisingly enough, the reason for such as reports say might as well be the president himself. His daily press conferences are the only public interactions he has with the press, meaning that's the only opportunity reporters and media outlets have to try and confront him. Obrador is rather known by professionals for his hostility towards the media, using his daily conferences to berate independent journalists and activists.
El problema está peor hoy que nunca. Está peor
No,
que nunca.
no, no.
¿Cómo así? Eso
No
eso
es así.
indican las cifras.
No es así. Hay una diferencia fundamental. Estos no son crímenes de Estado.
¿Cómo se sabe si los casos no son
Porque
resueltos?
tenemos todos los elementos.
On top of that, the government has cut funds for investigations and weakened the protection program it offers journalists. The system consists of an extremely small number of journalists selected by the authorities from all of the professionals under threat. Those receive 24-hour protection from bodyguards and a device that is supposed to be an emergency button.
Vamos a hacer una prueba si quieren.
Dale.
¿Cuánto se supone que se demoran en llamarte?
Y debe de ser inmediato. Pero pues ahorita ya vamos.
Ya han transcurrido que 30 a 40 segundos.
Para mí se me hace un botón muy tonto. Si fuera para una emergencia, no vas a poder. Para mí no sirve de nada, solamente para encontrar tu cuerpo.
Although it has saved the lives of journalists in armed attacks, they claim that there's no denying this is a patch solution. For instance, 2 journalists killed in 2020 were under supposed federal protection after receiving death threats related to their work. Their respective bodyguards were also murdered. But it seems that's just how things happen in Mexico. To be a newsman or a newswoman in the country is to live with a constant threat, a constant target on your head. The situation is so dangerous and critical that some journalists practically expect to die. In 2019, Maria de Lourdes Maldonado Lopez, a reporter from the state of Tijuana, directly addressed the president in one of his conferences to beg him for help.
Vengo también aquí para pedirle apoyo, ayuda y justicia laboral, porque hasta temo por mi vida.
She was murdered almost 2 years later in January 2022. That same week, in the same city in Tijuana, another journalist was killed, Margarito Martinez Esquivel, a veteran crime photographer. He was one of the few Mexican journalists that investigated organized crime and who wasn't afraid to show himself and use his real name. Martinez and his partner, Jesus Aguilar, worked for multiple local outlets covering crime scenes. They would receive crime reports on the radio through the Red Cross and the fire department frequencies and drive off to the given locations, being a constant presence in the streets of Tijuana. Having to deal with the danger of living in one of the most violent cities in the world, the colleagues had a buddy system to keep each other safe. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough to save Martinez from being shot outside his home on January 17, 2022. The thing is that those who investigate organized crime, corrupt officials, and their connections like Martinez and Ignacio Santiago, who were lucky enough to survive 7 armed attacks, are the most frequently targeted. Santiago, another Mexican journalist, claims that their heads have a price and not a very expensive one, around $250 and $2. It seems like getting rid of reporters is an effortless job for criminals.
En México, pues la libertad de expresión está muy cabrona. No es fácil ser periodista. Si quieres ser periodista y no tener problemas, no puedes tú ser periodista, debes ser chayotero. Debes de venderte al mejor postor y simplemente publicar lo que él quiera en tu medio y nunca exhibir la verdad.
Mexican cities are known for being victims of cartel activity. Some cities are completely taken and ruled by one criminal group, while others are no man's land, more of a contested territory. And in the everyday battle and struggle for power, perhaps one of the most valuable weapons is information. A twisted route. Amidst this ongoing battle, what we see are different groups and factions who, in order to win this information war, decide to take over and instrumentalize flows of information. As a result, they create an extremely harmful phenomenon: anonymous Facebook pages. In other words, Facebook pages and profiles run by people or groups that don't identify themselves and choose what and how to share whatever information they want. We all know how social media works up to this point. At the same time that it may be the most democratic way anyone can get their information anywhere they want, it is also a place where anyone can easily twist that same piece of information, and as a result, build dangerous communities that can spread nothing but lies and fear. Millions of Mexicans, for instance, don't have access to the internet. Instead, they have Facebook on their phones for free, and that is where they go to get their daily news. That is also where they go to get what they want to see. Anonymous pages sharing information about the violent and criminal acts that occur in various Mexican cities. A common complaint that some citizens have is that journalists don't uncover the truth behind each criminal and narco group act. People say they don't tell the whole story, whereas those Facebook pages always depict those incidents with as much gruesome detail as one can get a full report with names, uncensored pictures, and information about alleged gang members, criminal leaders, and corrupt politicians. Pieces of information and images that investigative journalists don't share. But then you might be asking yourself why that is, and the answer is simple. Journalists don't publish this information not by incompetence, but by choice. As on the surface, it may seem as if those pages are exposing and denouncing the criminal underworld, reporters suspect that they are actually instruments created by the cartels themselves to out their rivals, working on behalf of organized crime.
Entonces, estas páginas anónimas nos meten en problemas por la manera en la que escriben, en la que exhiben problemas muy fuertes, delicados prácticamente.
But to make this scenario even worse, some Mexican journalists known for their investigative work, such as Ignacio Santiago and Margarito Martinez, ended up being accused of a connection to such pages. This has turned their everyday struggle in Mexico into a true quest for survival. For instance, it was because he was accused of running one of those pages called Tijuana en Guerra that Martinez was killed. Sonia de Anda, another veteran reporter in Tijuana, explains that those anonymous pages came up as a necessity for those criminal groups once they realized that they couldn't force media outlets or journalists to spread their messages. Despite the fuss and chaos they could cause with their threats and banners, Mexican journalists had made somewhat of a pact agreeing not to share these kinds of messages, solely because they believed that it would make them a spokesperson for these groups.
Pero los grupos criminales encontraron un nicho de oportunidad en las redes sociales. Por eso es que hoy, para nosotros, este tipo de páginas sí nos están poniendo en riesgo. Que están diciendo que los periodistas no lo decimos y el día que los periodistas los enfocamos, en ese momento nos volvemos blancos.
When confronted by journalists and questioned about the page's policy and functioning, it's possible to get an insightful guess of who the people behind them might be. The anonymous page administrator claims to get its sources and contacts from both anonymous sources and the so-called dependencias, or government offices. They go on to say that everything they publish has been investigated first, and that they are not at all affiliated with organized crime in any way. On the contrary, they claim that Margarito Martinez's death, resulting from being accused of running the page, is proof that they are doing a good job by provoking and unsettling those criminals. Although, when we stop for a minute, that seems kind of an unsettling and disturbing answer, doesn't it? All of this just helps to give us more evidence of what a recurring nightmare it is to be a journalist in Mexico. Concerned about this situation, the Cartel project, coordinated by the non-profit organization Forbidden Stories, which tries to continue the work of reporters who are threatened, censored, or killed, revealed details about how journalists have been monitored by espionage units whose main responsibility was to prevent organized crime in the first place. Criminal groups often collude with local authorities, which leads to journalists being not only targeted, but also not finding any help from the authorities that are supposed to protect them. The federal government had done very little to stop the violence. The result is impunity in the vast majority of crimes against the press, which fuels and incentivizes more attacks against journalists, says John Albert Hootson. All of this makes it more than obvious to us that press freedom has most likely never been as violently threatened as it is now in Mexico. According to professionals, mostly due to total inactivity and passivity from the country's highest authorities regarding this case. Critics and opposers of President Andrés López Obrador conclude that his behavior helps make things even worse. They claim that the president isn't taking any action against the situation, and his behavior of constantly attacking and harassing journalists is perceived by criminals as an invitation to violence. It's as if the country's highest authority was permitting every Mexican to do whatever they would like to, whoever they would like, possibly starting an even bloodier era of deadly violence against the press. Proof of that might have been an apparent attempt to murder one of Mexico's most well-known news anchors, Ciro Gomez Leiva from Grupo Imagen. On December 15, 2022, he was driving a bulletproof SUV in Mexico City when a man on a motorcycle opened fire on him. It is worth worth noticing that hours before the attack, López Obrador was publicly defaming the professional, stating that if Mexicans listened to such people too much, they risked developing brain tumors. In an open letter to the president, professionals from all major Mexican outlets reprehended the president's aggressive behavior towards the media. Almost all of the outpouring of hatred towards journalists is incubated, born, and disseminated from the presidential palace. Our indignation over this incident leads us to demand that President Andrés Manuel López Obrador ceases his harassment of critical journalists. And the letter concludes, if President López Obrador does not control his angry instincts towards critical journalists, the country will enter an even bloodier phase than those which other Latin American countries have previously lived through, the murder of journalists in order to destabilize the government, or killing in return for government favors. And the truth is, there are no arguments against plain facts. As we've seen before, the numbers give us a better understanding of how critical the situation in Mexico under Obrador's government apparently is. During Obrador's predecessor, Enrique Peña Nieto's entire administration, 45 journalists were killed. If we take the data from López's administration until 2022, we have 42 registered murders, and 2023's and 2024's numbers have yet to be added on. An aftermath? So what happened to Uresti after the video's release? It didn't take long for Milenio TV and Azucena to comment on the threat. The network released a statement saying that it supports all their colleagues in Azucena Uresti. We reject this attack against freedom of expression and demand that the authorities carry out a prompt investigation that guarantees the safety of Azucena Uresti and our fellow journalists, who have always distinguished themselves for their courage in addressing issues related to organized crime and others, without taking sides at any given time by any particular group. Exercising journalistic leisure and reporting on the violence of organized crime at all levels is a risk. But at Grupo Milenio, we maintain the unwavering commitment to continue doing so, impartially, and attending to the right of our audience to quality information. To all our comrades, we reiterate our solidarity. On the same day as the video was released, Uresti addressed the threats in a statement at the beginning of her program. With the teams that I lead, we always seek balance and confirmation of all the information that we present here. We will continue, without bias, with data and precise facts that show what is happening in the country. She concluded by announcing that she was added to a government protection program for journalists and human rights defenders under threat. But as we know by now, that doesn't really mean that she's exactly safe, especially when the threat in question is the most dangerous criminal organization in Mexico. But not only that, things also get worse when we consider that the country's maximum authority, as much as having expressed his solidarity with Azucena and other journalists, might have proven by his actions in the last months to have broken his vow. Back then, López Obrador said, "I want to express my solidarity to the journalist Azucena Uresti for the threat she received from one of the criminal organizations. I want to tell her that she has counted on us since I found out. Communication has already been established with her. We're going to protect Azucena, and we are to protect all Mexicans. It's our responsibility. The authority is no longer in the hands of the mafias, so I reiterate my solidarity with this journalist, Azucena Uresti, and to all journalists, guaranteeing that our government will always protect those who carry out this profession." After other personalities such as novelists, political analysts, and former presidents flooded the journalists' social media expressing their solidarity, Uresti issued her thanks on Twitter, thanking everyone who reached out to her. But amidst so many cases, reports, threats, and murders, like the ones we uncovered at the beginning of this video, you might be asking yourself, why is the Uresti case the one incident worth talking about today? First, because this is a pretty unusual case, really. As Jan Albert Hutzen described back then, this case truly stands out. It very rarely happens that drug trafficking cartels or organized crime groups threaten reporters who are active in Mexico City, let alone anchor people at nationally syndicated news shows, as described by the journalist Hector de Moleon, which was also threatened in 2017. The Uresti case is the most full frontal attack against the press that has been made by an armed group. What also happens is that, different from all the other custom threats against journalists in the country, which are aimed at local reporters operating in regions where rival crime groups fight for control, this one was a rare threat in video form to a national journalist well known in the entire nation. As we've seen previously, those are the Mexican journalists at greater risk after all, the independent ones, who work for small, underfunded local outlets, publish directly on social media, report for community radio stations, or print modest weeklies. Besides, it's kind of bizarre when we stop for a moment and realize how one of the most powerful and dangerous criminal organizations in the world, with enough resources to battle and possibly take down its own government, records a video threatening a national television news anchor over biased and unfair media coverage. Terrifying, of course, but quite bizarre, isn't it? As Hutzen describes, this is the same group that allegedly planned and carried out an attack on the head of Mexico City's police not too long ago, and that has organized and carried out deadly attacks on federal security forces, including including the Mexican army. But a public threat to a journalist was indeed new. However, we must admit that the speaker in the video is right on a certain point. As he says, some of those self-defense groups have been infiltrated by drug traffickers. But according to Hipólito Mora, also threatened in the video, some groups were indeed criminals, while others should be supported as they managed to kick out their criminal members. In the end, this is just a result of the long and troubled history the state of Michoacán has with self-defense militias, which obviously does not justify the CJNG's threat. But this, unfortunately, is Mexico, the country where criminals are outraged. As we have uncovered in this video, it's easy to understand that Azucena Uresti's case wasn't the first and much less the last attack suffered by Mexican journalists. Year after year, Mexico continues to prove itself as one of the world's most dangerous and deadliest countries for media professionals. If you like this content, make sure to click on one of the cards on the screen to watch similar videos.